Alright, hello everybody, welcome to our next lesson here. We're going to look at the lives of working women today. So our objectives and standards to recognize the lives of working women in the period and to analyze how women organized for better working rights and conditions. And please take a moment there to read the standards if you would. And our desired result, what challenges and changes did women face in terms of working? Two vocab words here. Boarder is someone who receives meals when they stay somewhere in return for payment. And the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association, which was formed in 1844 to try to improve working conditions. So different jobs for different women. The lives of working women were different. Sorry about that. Different, I should say there. Different on their location and their background. Now, most middle-class women did domestic work in the home. Some women in the South were members of slave-owning families who had slaves who did most of their work. And this picture here just kind of shows you the fashion that women were kind of wearing in the 30s, 40s, and 50s when we're talking about here. Other working-class women had to struggle for themselves and their families. And women in slave-owning families would supervise slaves and care for the farm and the home. Now the countryside. Living in rural or countryside areas, women worked to produce most of what the family needed. Women would help care for the garden, also livestock such as cows, pigs, and chickens. They also made products such as clothing and candles that could be sold in towns. And some women in the South were not required to work on farms and had slaves do most of the hard labor. But a lot of women who lived in the South who were poor had to do the hard labor to support their families as well. So working in town. Living in towns, women were unable to produce their own food, so they had to obviously buy their food. So some women had to get jobs to help support their families to buy items such as food. Others would sew clothing or fabric, or some even ran grocery stores or taverns with their husbands. Now, there were also women who accepted boarders, and a boarder is someone who will stay at someone's house for a certain amount of time, and they'll pay for a bed, laundry services. So some women ran these boarding houses or boarding locations for travelers or people like that. They were able to make some money that way. Some women also worked as what was known as washerwomen, which is like you give your laundry to them, they would wash it, and then you'd go pick it up or they'd return it to you. Or even street vendors. Sometimes we see street vendors today in the cities and stuff like that. They're selling food or souvenirs. A lot of times back in the 1800s, women were probably offering food, or maybe they were selling clothing or scarves or something like that. Now, minority women and working. While many African American women were slaves, there were a few free African Americans, but they also struggled as well. Many, especially, were in poverty, and they were also separated from white society. They worked as cooks, servants, doing laundry, or they even took in boarders as well. And single or married, many free African American women had to work to support their families. Many African Americans, whether they be male or female, were not paid the same amount as Caucasian or white males or females. So even if a woman's African American husband worked, she might have to work as well to help support the family. Now, the lives of slave women were especially difficult, especially working in the fields or doing domestic work. But also another group we haven't really talked too much about is Mexican American women. And they frequently lived in the frontier areas, which would become part of the U.S. in the 1840s. Now, they also worked in many different jobs, such as farming, weavers, bakers, ranchers, and craftspeople as well. So women protest and strike. Factory and mill owners in the 1830s and 1840s decided to increase production. So to help do this, they cut wages and they sped up workers to work faster. Conditions of boarding houses also became worse for many women. So because of these lower wages, poor conditions they were living in, and being forced to work faster or longer hours, they went on strike and protest over these conditions a couple of times, actually in 1834, 1836, and the 1840s. Now, the Lowell Female Reform Association was formed in 1844 to try to improve working conditions under a woman by the name of Sarah Bagley, who was its president. Now, goals for this association were to reduce working hours to 10 per day. Women were frequently working 12, 13, 14 hours per day, so they tried to reduce the hours to 10 per day. And a petition was actually signed by many workers and actually people who were living in the town of Lowell, Massachusetts. Unfortunately, it was rejected by lawmakers after a committee investigated it in 1845. Following attempts at reform, factory owners began to prevent members from organizing to strike or protest, and so instead, the Lowell Female Reform Association then sought to simply assist members facing difficulties individually. So the work of immigrants. Mill and factory owners also used immigrant workers, both male and female. In the 1840s, Irish and Central European immigrants arrived in the U.S. in large numbers, and many new immigrants were very eager to work, even if it meant low wages. So immigrants will begin to replace white young women in mills and factories. You might be saying, well, why is that? Well, because many of these young white women wanted higher wages, as we were talking about earlier, why they were protesting. And so since many of these immigrants were willing to work for less money and less pay, many factories and mills saw that as a benefit. So they would rather hire an immigrant and pay them less than pay the young white woman what she wanted. Native-born workers, because of this, began to leave factories and mills as wages and working conditions deteriorated or went downhill. So the workforce of mills was made up of nearly a quarter of Irish by 1860. So new jobs for women. The best professions, best jobs, such as in law or the military or in medicine, say as a doctor, were closed to women. In 1850, however, the first medical school to train female doctors opened in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It was known as the Female Medical College of Philadelphia. However, no women were admitted to be a lawyer or to law school until after the U.S. Civil War. In terms of science, in 1847, Maria Mitchell discovered a new comet and became the first woman to have success as a female scientist, and she was actually elected to the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 1850, the only female to that point. And most churches would not accept women preaching in church, but some small religious groups, such as the Society of Friends or the Quakers and the Congregationists, did employ female ministers. The one sure job that a woman was seen okay, quote unquote, as working as was a teacher. Teaching was seen as an acceptable job of women, especially young, unmarried women. But despite doing the same work, female teachers were frequently paid less than male teachers. Okay, so what challenges and changes did women face in terms of working? Think about that, and help you answer your last question there. Hope you have a great rest of your day or night, and I hope to talk to you soon.